since brevity is the soul of wit.
More of your conversation would infect my brain.
Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?
To speak of him as my kinsman, he's a most notable coward, an infinite and endless liar, an hourly promise breaker, the owner of no one good quality worthy your lordship's entertainment.
I'd beat thee, but I should infect my hand.
The lady doth protest too much, methinks.
The course of true love never did run smooth.
You're Lindsay.
You're Aiden. I'm Lindsay.
Yes, yep. Those are both true facts. And you are listening to the Bix Pod. And this week we are talking about
Henry VI, Part 1.
Part 1
of 3.
Yes.
This is a slog.
This one
is
going to take some time.
I'm not looking forward to Part 2 and 3. We're
Part
not selling this very well, are we?
Yeah, it's going to be a great episode, Lindsay.
It's going to be awesome.
Awesome. It's going to be just as good as the play.
Oh crap!
Yeah, that was not a good endorsement.
Aiden, what's Henry VI all about?
I'm ready to tell you, Lindsay. Are you ready to time me telling you?
I'm ready to time you telling me.
Okay, you tell me when, and I will start.
You've got 30 seconds on the clock to give us a plot, play-by-play.
No, it's just a synopsis. I can't give you the play-by-play. Shut up. Just do it.
Go.
So, this is, you might think Henry VI's Wars of the Roses, but this is actually the prequel to the Wars of the Roses. This is the war in France. That's what this whole play is about. It's all about everybody fighting after Henry V died. There, you've got Talbot, which is the main guy on the English side, and you've got Joan of Arc, the legend, on the French side. And you get a little bit of both sides, and they basically, Talbot and Joan of Arc, they fight it out back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then the French win, and oh my god, that's it. Oh, and Talbot dies at the end.
Well, all right. Yeah, you made it. You made it. That's our time.
Sweet. Whew, that was close. But that's it. I feel like I adequately described the play, actually, Lindsay. How do you think I did?
Yeah, basically. I mean, from what I remember of it. I just finished reading it last night, and
it's already exited your brain.
Yeah. This was a really not engaging play for many reasons, which we will get into.
Yeah.
When I was writing up the notes for this, I started off with good things about the play and problems with the play. And we filled like 2 pages with problems and only a couple paragraphs for the good, which is problematic for the play. Does it bode poorly for the
let's
play?
just say that this is one of the least performed plays of all of Shakespeare's works.
Right.
By and large, I would say even the other Henry VI parts get a little bit more attention.
Well, the thing with that is that it's it pales in comparison to the other tetralogy that covers this period. So let's back that up a bit. There are 2 tetralogies, which makes 8 plays that cover the Wars of the Roses, basically. And the first one starts with Richard II, and the last one ends with Richard III. So they're written out of order. It's really confusing. So these later plays, the Henry and Richard III, were written earlier than the plays chronologically set earlier, like Henry V and Henry IV.
So basically there was an original series of these ones, then they did the prequels, which were much better.
Kind of like Star Wars.
Okay, so
these are not as good. No, but no, when you think about it now, no, like just in terms of how they were made.
Yes.
But these are not of the same caliber.
No, it's the opposite. It's the inverted quality scale of the prequels to the original Star Wars films. And we should specify, we're doing this in the order of Henry VI Part 1, then we'll do Part 2, and then Part 3.
Which is not how they were written.
Probably not. The evidence that there is about the production history and writing is that probably Part 2 and 3 came first, and then he came back to do Part 1.
Yeah.
That might not have been the order in which they were written, though, because there are some tiebacks and stuff. Anyways, it's kind of convoluted, but we're doing them in this order.
Yeah.
Just because it made sense.
Well, and yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go with Henry II when you haven't Part 2.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing that's confusing is that there are multiple parts here. So we are just, when we approach these, we're approaching them in the order that they would be chronologically speaking.
I guess.
But even then, it's not, like within the play, Henry VI deals with some wonky timeline stuff.
Yeah,
like it's very
it makes
strange.
no sense.
But
there's a lot of issues with the play.
Yeah, for being a history play, it certainly it plays
very
fast and loose with the
yes.
history.
Absolutely.
Which is not a bad thing. I think
you would need to give some structure and some semblance of main characters to the plot. So it is set immediately after the death of Henry V. In fact, the play opens with the funeral procession of Henry V. But at that point, Henry VI was like a year old, 6 months or something like that. And then like 2 acts later, he makes his first appearance, and he sounds like he's supposed to be a teenager, possibly. So obviously that's not accurate.
Right.
And all the events that happen in France are kind of compressed, and they all happen much earlier, and then obviously much later. Like
the main part of the opening scene that sets the stage for the rest of the play is that the king has died. There's this young son on the throne who needs guidance and a protectorate put in place so that so his uncles end up stepping in and fighting over who's going to actually lead. And then the territories that Henry V conquered in France are lost immediately. This all happens in the first scene.
Yeah.
And that isn't true to the way that things happened. No. Like that took a few
many
years.
years. Yeah. Henry VI was, I think, in his 20s when they lost most of their possessions in France.
Right.
So
which were hard won and definitely not something that the English were proud of. But as we talked about in our history episode, Henry VI did get to wear the crown of France. So losing those territories in France happening right now immediately after he takes the throne is a bit of a fan fiction-y rewrite of history,
exactly.
Which works to heighten the drama such as it is in this play, which, as Aidan mentioned, is really just a volley back and forth between these cities, Rouen and Champagne and other areas that are just...
Was it Champagne?
No,
Jeez,
maybe
it's
it
not even. Yeah, I don't.
But like
Orleans, or maybe. Yeah, I don't remember.
In French hands, and then they're in English hands, and then they're in French hands, and then they're in English hands.
Sometimes
and
in really, one scene, this happens. So
it's that's the thrust of the play. Henry VI has very few lines. He's not really present in the play. For a play that's written about him, it's really about the early trials and tribulations of his reign,
but not about him as a character.
Right. There are far more like central characters. John Talbot, who is the terror of the French.
Yeah.
Joan of Arc plays a central role. Charles the Dauphin of France has a much larger role than Henry VI does. Even some of the other women, like the Countess of Auvergne and
she
Margaret
plays
of
a more
Anjou,
active role. Yeah, exactly.
Have much bigger roles and are set up to be bigger roles in the future plays, which were written before this probably. But anyway, and then there's the issue that we'll get into of probably this play was not written solely by Shakespeare. So that lends some problematic aspects to the writing as well. If you've been reading along with us, we would love to hear what you think about the play, but again, these are just our opinions about as writers looking at this play. There are things that strike us as
not so good.
Yeah.
Some are born great. Some achieve greatness.
Sister.
And some have greatness thrust upon them.
So, Linz, what was the one thing that I see in our notes that you wrote that was a good thing about the play?
Well, I do think that John Talbot is a compelling character in this play. He's not the most well-rounded of Shakespeare's
heroes,
protagonists or anything, but he is sort of a compelling figure. He's when we were first introduced to him in the play, he's captured. He's a French prisoner of war, and they're trading for him to come back. And he gets back, and he is this figure that is very much revered by the English and feared by the French. So when we have him encountering the Countess of Auvergne later, she makes fun of him for being short of stature and kind of a ghost of a man, or a shadow of a man, I think is how she puts it, which probably suggests that the early performances were his performance was played by somebody who was short or maybe not as imposing a figure. So that makes it compelling because you think there's, even if that isn't true, even if the actual first Earl of Shrewsbury or whatever his title wasn't this shriveled, short, non-imposing person, it does lend something interesting to the character. Like maybe he's got something to prove.
Exactly. Well, not just that he has something to prove, but that he's more than he looks.
Yeah.
Whereas every other character, with probably the exception of Joan of Arc, plays into their role very, very clearly. There's no wiggle room. There's no room for nuance in any of these.
And
other
I think
characters.
that's mostly because there are so many characters. If you look at the cast of characters, I didn't count them, but in my ebook reader, it took me 3 taps on the page to get past the list of characters.
Yep.
And they're separated into English and French. So there's just lists of people and names. Wiltshire and Shropshire and Cheshire and no, those
are all real shires, which is crazy enough. But,
but they're all just names of people that they don't have time to have any kind of character depth or development of any kind. No. Talbot is the one character who comes into the play with this. He was a revered character. People knew who he was. He was a popular figure in even the Elizabethan age. There was a writer at the time who, it may have been Thomas Nash, maybe, or Kidd. I don't know. One of the contemporaries of Shakespeare wrote in a pamphlet or a book that he, after seeing this play, that how cool would it have been, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, how cool would it have been for Talbot to see himself portrayed, risen from the grave 200 years later. Well, it wasn't 200 years later, but to come back and be this central, imposing figure marching on the Elizabethan stage. So he was kind of a folk hero, I guess. So he's allowed to have a little bit more depth, which makes it strange that he gets some of the weirdest character moments. I think, Aidan, you mentioned when we were talking earlier today about the scene where Talbot and his son have a bit of a discussion, and it's in rhyming couplets, and it's very forced. And when I was reading it, it reminded me of if you're a teacher listening to this podcast, you know what I'm talking about. If if you've ever been a teenager, you know what we're talking about. Right, I guess that's true. But you hand in an assignment or you write a poem and you think it's really great and it's kind of forced, and that's what this feels like. It does not feel Shakespearean, that's for sure. Yeah, it's a little. It's not that Shakespeare can't do rhyming couplets, because he does do them in other plays, but they're done much more effectively, and it's much less trite. Yes, the topics being discussed are essentially Talbot's son is like, well, don't send me away from the battle right before I get to prove myself. I want to be a hero just like you, Pops. And Talbot says, well, no, but you have to carry on the family name. And that's it. And they just go back and forth. It's very much like the capture of Rouen, because they just go back and forth on this forever until Talbot basically says, okay, yeah, you can stick around. There's no actual in-depth kind of rhetoric at play, especially, whereas Shakespeare, when he does these kind of rhyming poetics, it's to really cap off a strong point that someone else has made. Well, yeah, usually it's like the last 2 lines of the first interaction that Romeo and Juliet have, where it's a sonnet and the rhyming couplet kind of caps off this height of emotion. Yeah. In this case, it really does feel like you're forcing the rhyme to fit the line. Yes. And it's also notable, we should mention, that most of this play is written in iambic pentameter. Yep. It's written in verse. Whether it rhymes or not is not important, but there's a sophistication to some of Shakespeare's later poetic verses where it's blank verse more than it is rhyming verse. Mm-hmm. There's just way more rhyming verse in this play. Per line of this play, absolutely, yeah. But it's things like, I pulled up the it's not the exact scene, but it's an example of this rhyme. So this is after Talbot comes in after, I think this is after his son has died. Yes, it is after his son has died. Where's my other life? My own is gone. Oh, where's young Talbot? Where is valiant John? Triumphant death, smeared with captivity, young Talbot's valor makes me smile at thee. When he perceived me shrinken on my knee, his bloody sword he brandished over me, and like a hungry lion did commence rough deeds of rage and stern impatience. It's just very, very Hallmarky kind of. A little bit. Right? And so to give this great character who had, up until this point, had built up this stage presence and at least this legend, this is not Henry V on the field of battle, commanding an army. This is a very different kind of war hero. Yes, and it is interesting because a lot of the characterization
of Talbot comes from those talking about him, just on the English side especially. The French side, you don't get it very much except for the Countess of Armagnac. Is it Armagnac or Auvergne?
Auvergne.
Who basically insults him to his face before realizing that, oh no, he's actually scary.
Right.
And so it's really kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy about what Talbot is, because he is built up by so many of the characters. And I think this is getting to a point that we wanted to make about what the purpose of this play is. The play is English propaganda.
Oh, of course.
Through and through. And that's something that becomes blatantly obvious. Obviously, the time it was written, you couldn't write something with, a really good, interesting French side to the story.
No.
That would be heresy. So in the terms of Talbot's character, it's very much, he is built up to be this kind of mythical figure. And then the humanizing moments kind of feel shoehorned in a little bit.
Yeah.
So honestly, the best moment of Talbot's character is when he meets the Countess of Auvergne.
Yeah.
And he's talking about himself a little bit.
Yeah.
And he has a chance to say, well, yes, I'm not an imposing figure, but yet I'm really good at fighting wars because I'm smarter than everybody else. And that's when his soldiers rush in to, recapture him from the Countess who thought she'd caught him in a trap, right? And I think that's really the one really redeeming feature about Talbot is that moment when he gets to kind of explain himself a little bit more and doesn't let the play hold him in check quite as much as it does with all the other characters.
And what is interesting about that is that the actual John Talbot was it's I think the general consensus with criticism of the play is that the references that are made in that scene are made because of the person who was originally playing this role.
Yeah.
And so that is an instance where, breaking the fourth wall is kind of a trite way of putting it, but I think that's kind of what's happening here, right?
Yeah.
Like, yes, this person on stage might be shorter than the man playing the Countess of Auvergne. So we're gonna throw him some lines that reference this a little bit. But that is interesting. It is a kind of a funny way of dealing with it. And you're right. I think that is probably his most interesting scene. But I think he is at his most interesting before he's even stepped up on the stage at all.
True.
Like, it's always like the monster in a horror film. Once you see it, it takes away the power.
Yeah.
So hearing about this John Talbot, this master figure that the English need to have back in order to keep France in check, hearing about him by characters talking about him while he's off stage is far more effective than actually seeing him in the flesh. And that happens quite a bit in the play. I feel like there's a lot of things that are described off stage that aren't shown. And it is a problem, but I think it's something that is a practical problem of just how do you stage a battle?
In some cases. In other cases, there's no excuse for it. So we'll get back to that anyways, because there was one good thing I wanted to say about the play.
Yeah.
And it's kind of in contradiction to what you just said. I found there was actually a fair bit of language that did still reek of the quality Shakespeare. There were times when I was reading it and I was just like, you know what? Oh wow, that was a good line.
Yeah.
This was a good little pun that he snuck in there. Or this just reeks of his, moving the bits around, as said on Upstart Crow. That's his favorite bit, is when he just moves the words around and it works somehow. Yeah. So and the one scene that kind of stuck out to me was when Gloucester and Winchester, one of whom is Henry VI's uncle. I think Gloucester is his uncle and Winchester is also a distant relative. Anyways, they fight from the start of the play right up to the end. And in Act 3, Scene 1, they have a nice little back and forth about who's at fault for everything. And I think it's Gloucester says to Winchester, "Thy lewd, pestiferous, and dissentious pranks, as very infants prattle of thy pride. Thou art a most pernicious usurer, froward by nature, enemy to peace, lascivious, wanton, more than well beseems a man of thy profession and degree."
I think I said that to you during our last argument, didn't I?
You can shut your mouth.
That's good. I like that.
It is good, right? And those kind of insults like that, Shakespeare's very good at crafting a really good burn into someone's face. So, and there's more in that scene. There's a bunch more puns, I think, and some kind of like underhanded stabs and stuff because Winchester's a priest, and so he's saying like, "Well, you love the flesh" and stuff like that. There's a lot of those little ones.
Yes.
It was interesting to read, and when we watched the play, it was also one of the few moments I was like, oh yeah, go. Like
Yeah.
that, you know, I was actually kind of invested in what the characters were talking about a little bit,
Right.
because otherwise it was a bit of a drag.
I'm glad you brought up that there are moments where the language is very florid and
it works.
quote unquote Shakespearean, and
Yeah.
it works.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what there were moments absolutely for me when I'm reading and I'm, you know, it's John Talbot and his son back and forth, and I'm like, oh, okay, when can we get to the end of this? But then, you know, a couple of pages later, there would be something that just leapt off the page with how descriptive it was, or how a roundabout way of getting to the point in that very Shakespearean way that I love. So I think that points to either one of two conclusions, that either this play was started when Shakespeare was very young, maybe even a teenager or something, and that he revised it later on, or that there were multiple authors and that they were each given a section of the play or a scene of the play to write, and that it was cobbled together, which, you know, in my research for this episode, that wasn't very uncommon.
No, that was kind of the standard
norm,
approach, yeah.
right? Like, I think that the way that we approach writing today, it's that there's a singular author who is responsible for crafting the whole of the story, and I don't think that existed back. There was no ego about writing. You didn't get your name put on the front page until the first folio. It wasn't even that important. But we need to be careful not to ascribe something more to that than what it actually maybe meant. Like, I think it was 2016 when the New Oxford Shakespeare edition actually credited Christopher Marlowe as a co-writer for the three Henry VI plays, which was kind of scandalous and sent people into an uproar at the time. But it seems like when you actually read the play, and this was my first time reading the play, so when you're reading it, like before this, I thought, well, how can they tell this? How do you know? But it's so clear that this is either one writer at very different stages in their career, or very different stages in the muses, you know, channeling the muse into their writing, or it's two totally different people.
Yeah.
So that's very clear. When those moments happen that Aidan mentioned, when the writing does get away and is, you know, transports you to another place, those are really elevated moments. They don't happen very often.
No, and they're not necessarily the elevated moments of the plot.
No, they're not.
In a lot of cases, they're not.
Yeah.
Which makes it doubly kind of interesting that you notice them when they do come up.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like a boring conversation between two people that, you know, it
you
really
don't
doesn't
really care
matter.
much
It's
about.
the sixth of, you know, Gloucester and Winchester bickering.
Yeah.
But you notice that the language is different, right? That's what's interesting to me. I will say one thing I didn't put in our notes that I wanted to bring up is that the famous scene at the temple, the gardens where the white and the red roses are picked.
Yeah, because we didn't even mention that in the plot synopsis.
No, we didn't.
There's a whole other plot going on that's not set in France, not focused on the war itself, and it is basically the brewings of the Wars of the Roses.
Right.
It is the Civil War being birthed, essentially. And we'll talk about it quite a bit because there's a lot of problems with that plot as well. But yeah, sorry, you want to mention about
that scene is mythical. As I mentioned in our Wars of the Roses episode, it likely never happened. It was just constructed, much like the white and the red rose itself being kind of a construct of Henry VII, who united, I'm using air quotes, united the red and the white rose of Lancaster and York into the Tudor rose, which was just a big propaganda ploy in and of itself. It's branding. This is our brand, right?
Yeah.
So to have this shown in this play, referenced countless times in all kinds of literature about the Wars of the Roses, to actually read it, it's not the most engaging. You don't even really know that that's what's happening until far into the and then it becomes a motif that comes back. You know, the characters are wearing these roses. It's actually written in the stage directions that they come on with a white rose or with a red rose, and then they talk about how I'm going to turn your white rose red with blood, and your face is as pale as your rose, or whatever. It becomes a recurring motif. But this is the seed of where all of that comes from. And I would like to know, I think one of my goals in this sidebar here. One of my goals is to actually read the original source material that Shakespeare and others based this play on, because I'd like to know when that story actually took off. Like, it was it already something that was brewing in the legends at the time that this was set down,
or something? Yeah,
or was it completely invented by Shakespeare? I don't know, and I would like to find out. Just because it is such a, it feels like it could have been true, you know, like this is how these feuds get started. Well, you picked a red rose, I'm gonna pick a white rose, and then that's how we're gonna, you know,
but not at all,
show our loyalty.
But not at all, because they were claimants for the throne. Like, that's what it came down to. Of course,
but I'm just saying, like, it's the kind of thing that, like, this becomes part of our banner, and that's your banner, and now we're fighting each other, and it's the dueling symbols of those roses. And
in the history book I read, the Hollow Crown, the author Dan Jones specifically said that both the red and white roses had long, for hundreds of years, been symbols of these houses.
Right.
So it was not picked up in a flower courtyard.
No, of course,
in England somewhere. So but you're right. It is an interesting way that because that scene is actually one of the worst scenes in the whole play. So it's really interesting that it really kind of took hold as the origin story of the War of the Roses. As we now understand them as being between these two great houses. Because it's not an engaging scene. It's not really clear at all what's going on. And it does not portend to what the eventual Wars of the Roses were about, which was claiming the English crown.
But I still find it strangely compelling. Just that it's it is
the origin.
That it is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that this is how feuds start.
Yeah.
Like, you could see this being the reason why two families would fight. Like, this would be an early battle. I can't,
because I have no idea what they're fighting about. That's
that's the thing. Like, how do any feuds start? We don't know why Capulet and Montague are fighting. We just accept that they're fighting.
Yes,
right?
but then they didn't show us.
No, you're
when
right.
they started fighting without any reason.
You're right, because Shakespeare was a little bit more mature at that point, or
5
something.
years later,
But this feels very, I don't know. It just it speaks of a kind of a truth about the pettiness of arguments and how they can blossom and blow up into something much bigger that you don't even realize how it starts.
Sure, but I will say this felt like a shoehorn plot into a prequel. It's felt like,
no, for sure.
Part 2 was a big hit. They didn't call it Part 2. They just called it Henry VI.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, we need a prequel to cover the Talbot guy. Everybody loved Talbot.
Right.
Let's shoehorn this scene in there too.
It's Anakin talking about sand. Oh, that's what it is.
Yes.
Is that what it is?
No, we're really confusing the Star Wars
We
metaphors
are,
at this
totally.
point.
Let's stop.
There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
So we got that out of our system, the good stuff. Can we talk about the problems a little bit?
We bitched a lot about the good stuff too.
We did.
But yes.
I mean, we talked a little bit about the timeline wonkiness with Henry VI actually being an infant at the time and not a grown man, or at least a teenager. The loss of France not happening immediately after Henry V's death. I think that, like we said, is kind of a necessity of the stage. And it kind of bleeds into this secondary criticism that a lot of people have said about Henry VI, is that it doesn't adhere to the classical unities, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe this was an attempt to kind of make that fit. Like, we're going to condense this all so it happens in a much closer time period, because then it adheres to the unity of time. The classical unities are the unity of action, place, and time that were stated, by the Greek playwrights. That these are the three things that a play needed to be successful. It needed to have one time location, one place location, and the action all had to occur at once too, which doesn't quite happen.
For a war.
No, of course really you can't do it in a war. So I don't think that criticism holds a lot of water. Yeah. But I do see that maybe the playwrights of this production were kind of, shoehorning it, making it fit into a tighter time frame in order to, make it more palatable and digestible to an audience right? You can't have 30 years pass in a play. No. You know, there's some
guy with
guy walks out 30 years later. Right?
Yeah,
like that didn't really happen. So
and so I mean that does pose problems for the play though, obviously, because, you know, basically, as you mentioned, Basil Exposition jumps out at the start of the play and is like, we lost everything in France. Yes. And then 3 acts later, he can go back to Paris or the king can go to Paris to get crowned King of France suddenly, because Talbot's taken over everything again.
Yeah.
Even though he just spent, you know, the previous 2 acts getting tossed in and out of Orleans 2 or 3 times in a row. Right. So it's really, really confusing to just, read and to watch. You
it literally doesn't matter. Like it's just okay, these people are fighting. You know, some guy will come on and say Rouen is ours, and you're like, okay, he has a French name, I guess the French have Rouen. All right. Some English guy, okay, well, they have it now. The French have jumped over a wall, they have it now. It's just it's not consequential.
No.
And maybe that's the point.
We were talking about this, that perhaps the whole point of the constant back and forths is that the war is kind of futile and it tends to swing one way then the other. It's very much a kind of wheel of fate kind of approach to warfare in this section. And it also gives the impression, if you're handing it off to the fates, that England eventually losing, which everyone knows they do, isn't really England's fault. It's kind of the fates have decided that it's swinging back to France's side for the next 150 years, up to Shakespeare's time, right? So, you know, you could look at it that way as well. But yeah, to read and watch the play, it's very difficult. Now, there are quite a few stage directions in the text.
Way more stage directions than I've ever seen in any Shakespearean play.
This might be the most. And a lot of them have to do with battles. So there probably were a lot of battles on stage. Probably because that's what people like to see. Maybe Shakespeare, especially we were talking, if he was a 17, 20-year-old-ish guy, you know, he'd want to have big battles, especially as an actor. He'd be like, I'll play Talbot. Let's go fuck some dudes up.
Stab some people. Stabby, stab, stab. Let's, you know, like, because that's, you know, it's Avengers Endgame. That's what it is.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Right?
Having just seen
it's
that
Game
film.
of Thrones, the Battle of Winterfell.
Hopefully not, because that was disappointing.
But either way, it's very much just none of the battle scenes, none of the back and forth feels like it's very important, and that's kind of, none of this felt like it had any meaning.
Yes,
and it's maybe important to remember that this is the first part of 3. It's also the start of a much larger dynastic battle that's going to play out over the next 30 years. So of course it's not going to be, you know, the most critical. It's 100 Years' War. It's not the Wars of the Roses. It's part of we're seeing 6 or 7 of 1,000 minor battles that were played out over the 100 Years' War. So, I mean, they really weren't consequential.
No, it's true. And I mean, I guess in that sense of scope of history, it does make a certain amount of sense. But again, as drama, it's terribly boring to watch. And it's even harder to read.
Well, and I do have to wonder, you know, so only about 20% of all of the writing that was ever done in the Elizabethan age has survived to the modern day. So I don't know, and we don't know how many great battle scenes were ever depicted on the Elizabethan stage, how common these were. But you have to imagine that these probably were more common than, you know, the Romeo and Juliets or the All's Well That Ends Well, right? Like these kinds of things appeal to the guy. You're trying to compete with bear baiters, right? So, I mean, you're going to have some stabby, stab going on the stage, right? So, but the choice to depict battles like this, and especially battles as recent as the 100 Years' War and as recent as the Wars of the Roses, is there a certain amount of editorializing that's going on? Like the fact that these don't feel consequential, was that done on purpose or was that done for practical reasons? Because you can't, as Henry V says, or as Henry V, as it said, you can't have the Battle of Agincourt play out on a small thrust stage in an oval theater. So you're going to have to just listen to us describe it and imagine it with your heads. or in your minds, not with your heads, with your
Well,
brains.
it's your brain's in your head, sure.
Or is this a decision on the part of the playwright to say these are not important battles, so we're not going to spend a lot of time depicting these battles. We're just going to have a stage direction that says the French leap over the wall and then they're taken back the city.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of interesting because it's kind of stuck in between those two trains of thought. It's kind of like, well, the battles aren't important, but we're going to have tons of stage direction devoted to the battles and probably lots of time devoted to the battles. When the version we did watch, the BBC production, there was quite a bit of time devoted to stage battles and gunshots and stuff, like all sorts of fairly big effects and so on.
Which are choices that were made by the director. And I have never seen this performed on stage. It's very rare for this to be performed. It is performed as part of the War of the Roses.
Yes, if someone does
tetralogy.
the huge Wars of the Roses sequence, then yes, this is often part
and
of it.
And
but
if you've watched The West Wing, President Bartlett does go to New York to see the War of the Roses.
But it is usually truncated.
Yes.
In a lot of those cases, obviously you can't have 20 hours of play, however long it would take to do 6 or 8 plays. So it's usually truncated with part 2 and 3. In fact, the Hollow Crown TV series that came out a couple of years ago, it combines part 1, 2, and 3 into 2 hour-long episodes. Or maybe they're hour and a half, an hour, 45 minutes. But anyways, there's 2 parts to the Henry VI period within this history tetralogy. So even in the modern adaptations, they're cutting it down because it is A, not that engaging, and B, a lot of fighting and stage direction, which maybe you could do justice to now. You could have a Battle of Agincourt filmed. You were mentioning...
Henry Kenneth
V.
Branagh as Henry V did. Yeah. Jude Law as Henry V on stage, though. That was a little different.
That was a little different. It was
but
good.
But when you're filming it, you can nowadays you can do a lot more.
Yeah.
But only the BBC would put on in their complete works of William Shakespeare series that they did back in the 70s and 80s. They are probably the only people that have ever committed this to film in such a thorough manner.
Yes.
So, I mean, I guess props to them for that. But
Absolutely.
But it does make for...
allowed us to watch the play because this was the only way we were going to be able to see it. So.
And the only way we could watch it was streaming it through our library.
Yeah.
It's really not available anywhere.
It's very true.
But... which is surprising because there are, I mean, sidebar again. Brenda Blevin plays Joan of Arc, and
she does.
Bernard Hill plays
Duke of York.
Yeah, the Duke of York. So that's
any Lord of the Rings or Pride and Prejudice fans. That's what we recognize them with. That's King Theoden. That's Mrs.
Bennett.
This is Mrs. Bennett.
Yes.
I forget her name.
Yeah.
So
I mean, so that was kind of cool to see. But I mean, you know, it's 1980s BBC production, so it does every line, it does every scene.
And it is good.
It's good to watch.
It's good to watch.
If you have the chance to watch it and you're interested in it, go for it.
If somehow we've sold you on this play in this podcast,
you will see 2 war generals meeting each other on hobby horses.
Oh,
which made the whole thing worth it.
Yeah.
When they're like, I'm going to describe it to you. When they ride out in front of their armies and they like rock back and forth, but it's just them walking there with their it's ridiculous. It is so ridiculous.
We
it's
could
like
not believe
high school play
yeah.
production level.
But even in high school play, you would laugh at it and they would be doing it for jokes. And maybe
there would be a guy behind them with a pair of coconuts running behind them on stage, just pythoning the hell out of it. Which makes me wonder why this has not been done. No, done as a comedy is what I was going to say.
Okay.
But
yeah, I could see that too.
We're getting a little farther away from the problems of the play, I think. Or are we?
No, I think they're all really connected. I will jump ship a little bit from the production quality of any one performance to another kind of structural issue with the play, which is that there's no real protagonist until about Act 4. You don't really realize that Talbot is the main character because there are so many other characters, because there's so many other dramas going on around rivalries between Gloucester and Winchester.
It's a very unfocused play.
It is a very unfocused play. So you don't really get it until Talbot is kind of under siege and he's about to die, and his son shows up. Yeah. And they have that back and forth, and it's all poetic, and then his son dies, and then Talbot dies. And that's it's kind of after his son died, I'm like, oh, Talbot's the main character. And it was Act 4. And it was much too late. And again, it was retroactive that I came back to his character and said, oh yeah, he did have some interesting bits in there.
Yeah.
Because the other, again, kind of interestingly developed character is Joan of Arc, who goes through some major swings. Let's just put it that way. But yeah, so Talbot's character and the lack of clarity about his narrative being the major thrust of the play is very evident right up until he dies. The other ones that are jumping around, York and who's Somerset, are the two dueling ones in the start of the Wars of the Roses. They are eventually sent to relieve Talbot. And it's only at the very end there that their stories kind of intersect and connect. And the fact that they don't help each other leads to Talbot's death because they can't get their shit figured out in time to save him from the French. Right. So it's a very kind of haphazard bringing all these plots together near the end. Right. It feels very rushed. It feels very unstructured. Yeah. And
all of Act 4 and 5 really feel kind of like different.
Yes.
And that's where we see,
yeah,
but that's where we see the major changes in Joan of Arc, which I think we should put a pin in briefly just because.
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
What happens with her is much more interesting than anything else really that happens in the play.
It's true.
But yeah, you're right. There's a lack of focus that really only in hindsight you realize what the main thrust of the story actually is, which is, I guess, a failing on the part of the storyteller. But also, I mean, when you're trying to do justice to an actual event, you're trying to put as much of the truth in, quote unquote, truth as possible.
But are you? Because this is propaganda. He's already playing with so many things. Why not play with it?
But you're not going to say that, like... You can't combine 6 different earls or dukes into one character because then you'd piss off people who are sitting in the court at this day and these are their grandparents.
Sure, and have their characters still be there. Don't talk to them. Don't have them in speaking roles. Don't give them anything to do or anything to talk about.
But so yeah, that's what I mean. Where I say it's a fault on the part of the playwright with trying to do too much within the strictures of.
Trying to still match
play.
And trying to match close at least some form of the history that your audience would have understood and expected.
Like I can forgive the playing with the age of Henry VI because it makes it more compelling to have not a baby as the title character of a play. When you see what the opposite end of the spectrum is, which is to have every named character from every major duchy or whatever standing there and giving long monologues that, match up more or less with what Raphael Hollins had wrote or whatever. Yeah. Like, I think that on balance between those two, I would rather have messing around with the ages.
Yeah, definitely.
Like fit it into, recognize what the story is, whittle it down to what the actual thrust of the story is, which I think you're right. It's this great Talbot being, shot down in a volley of an air assault or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And that's the main point of the story, and have the emotional heft of him talking to his son, carry more weight than it does. Yeah. And
maybe introduce his son
more than
2 scenes before he dies. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I mean, here we are sitting in judgment on Shakespeare, or Shakespeare and Company. But I mean, it does seem like these are pretty basic mistakes to make. So which makes me wonder if this wasn't written by a young Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Just because it does seem like kind of a rookie mistake.
Yeah, it's a little juvenile. It's kind of what you do when you're not sure how closely to follow a source text, which Shakespeare is basically the master of nowadays. Right. We consider him the expert at taking something small like a rather small historical figure like Macbeth and turning him into this amazing
mythic figure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And here he just perhaps hasn't figured that out quite yet. Yeah. And so it does feel a little young, a little rushed. And it's not just in that character though, and that thrust. It's in there are other characters that also have issues. Yeah. I think actually one of the better ones, especially, and I think this was down to the production, but in the BBC production, Henry VI character was very well done for expressing how bad of a king he was.
Right.
He's very effeminate.
Yeah.
He's very frail and soft-spoken, and he just wants to do
Wait, are you saying that
ASMR
women
and
can't
stuff.
rule England?
Well, this is kind of what I was getting at, is why, because they really did make him quite
Yeah, they
effeminate,
did.
explicitly so. And I think we can talk about this a little bit later, but women are kind of like the bad characters in the
Yeah.
play. There's no good woman really
Right.
at the end of it. And Henry VI is basically described and portrayed as a woman. And in the BBC version, it's very explicitly so. But at the same time, that does get across that he was a very weak king. And there's only one kind of real dilemma that he faces. It's who to marry.
Right.
There's kind of two options. One is the Earl of someone's daughter.
Yep.
And then Margaret of Anjou, who he winds up actually marrying.
Right.
After a very brief kind of like monologue from the Earl of Somerset. I don't even remember. The one who's going to sleep with her in part 2.
Yes.
Basically.
Yes, which was heavily foreshadowed.
Yes.
Throughout their scene. Because he goes to meet her.
Well, he
and
captures her.
He
'cause they
captures
captured the
her,
town,
almost
yeah.
rapes her, and then decides, no, you're too beautiful for this.
So
I'm going
I'm
to
gonna
give
marry
you
you
to
the
my
king.
king.
So then I
But
can
we're going to
sleep-
flirt a lot. And
But he's the only one flirting. She's just kind of
Yeah.
like, what's going on, buddy?
yeah, it's very strange. But she becomes a very big figure. Margaret of Anjou is
Later
a very
on, yes.
powerful woman
Yeah.
figure in the Shakespearean canon. So it's interesting to see her origin story, I guess, if you want to use the Marvel analogy
yeah.
here. But yeah, for Henry VI, it's effeminate, but I think that's the way that productions would go when trying to show youth without showing youth. Without
Sure.
having Henry VI played by a 16-year-old, you would get an effeminate-looking older man to play that role, which is what this BBC production did.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see how other productions have done
Well,
it.
because he makes so many references to being young,
It's
and
true.
then you see him, and he's like,
And he
oh,
looks like
he's
he's 45.
40. He's definitely
Yeah.
in his 40s, yeah.
But it's you're right. Like, there is something very ineffectual about him, and it is
Yeah.
because he's kind of thin and wiry, and he
Yeah.
has very delicate
Yeah,
features.
in that way, he's perfectly
very
cast, right?
soft spoken.
Yeah.
And knowing what we know about Henry VI, I mean, he doesn't look anything like the depictions of Henry VI from paintings and court portraits, whatever that were done. But there is something of that persona that
Yes, that comes across.
yeah. And so to have Henry VI being the Lancastrian king that loses the throne to the Yorkist Edward IV, but then ends up like the Tudor comes in, like I'm trying to picture the
family
the
tree.
family tree again. Like Henry VII is distantly related to Henry VI,
Yeah.
but this is still a relation of the queen who was sitting on the throne at the time that this play was written and performed. Yeah. So there is still there. I would imagine there needs to be some decorum
Yes,
and delicateness
exactly.
in dealing with this character.
Exactly.
Like, you don't want to portray him as completely ineffectual.
Yeah.
The way that they do with the Yorkists, that it seems like the Richard III gets to be shuffled to the side as this villain, this outright villain. Yeah. But that's because Elizabeth's direct descendant usurped him, and that needed to happen. Yeah. Henry VI was usurped by someone who wasn't a good person that you're trying to build up. So
you don't have to build them back up. That's true,
you don't have but you still have to pay some deference to that character, which is why it's interesting. It's also interesting that he's portrayed so effeminately, but I don't know, like, given that there was a woman on the throne at the time, you would imagine that making women out to be evil. Yeah, but all the evil women in this play are French. So,
well, yeah, it's true, but there are no female women.
No, there aren't.
English women.
There are no female women.
There are no female women. Let me tell you.
There are no English females.
There's no
that
English
are
women
portrayed
at all.
Yeah,
so all the women are French, and the French are really the bad guys.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It follows naturally that the French are the baddies, and therefore the women are also inherently bad. And one of those is Margaret of Anjou, and her character is, I mean, again, she's introduced in Act 5. It's like scene 3. There's only a couple scenes left, and she's basically wooed over like hot cup of cocoa and nothing else. Like, it takes nothing. And she's like, yeah, okay, I'll be queen, sure.
Yeah. Just ask my dad. Just make sure it's fine.
Just make sure it's okay with my dad.
Yeah.
And it's very, very similar to Two Gentlemen of Verona and Taming of the Shrew, actually, in the way that women are kind of silenced. And especially at the end of Two Gentlemen of Verona really came to mind, because it was like, they don't get a say really in what happens to them at the end. Her saying, yes, I agree to this, is way more than the two ladies of Verona got. But it is kind of a pattern of these early Shakespeare plays that the women are not getting their fair shake. Except for
Joan of Arc.
Joan of Arc.
Joan of Arc is one of these characters. Now, I knew that she was in the play, and I knew that she was somebody important. We didn't talk about her in our Women of Shakespeare episode.
Not much.
But I think because we kind of avoided a lot of the historical figures, just because we're probably going to do separate episodes on them later on as we go through. Yeah, probably. But Joan is so fascinating because, and I'm going solely off of Brenda Blethyn's performance in the BBC production, because she really does a great job of, like, there's a lot of looking at the camera and some wall breaking. Yeah, I forgot to mention that during the Margaret wooing scene too. There's literally like, who are you talking to? During all these asides. Yes, that one hurt so bad because that is not Shakespeare's style. No. He does the asides even when there are multiple ones. Yes, the aside is a private moment that nobody else hears, but for Joan, she's built up from the beginning. She's introduced as this powerful person who has this drive, this thrust, and the force of history and narrative behind her. As she meets the Dauphin falls in love with her instantly after a very brief battle. Yeah, a little sparring match, as it were. Yep. And wants to marry her, and she says no, not until later. And she's very self-assured and self-possessed, and then she's a warrior, and she fights in all of these battles, which is a singular accomplishment for a woman in Shakespeare, who is not, I mean, I guess she is dressing like a woman or dressing like a man, but she's not pretending to be a man, which is very different from the way that Viola does in Twelfth Night, or any of the characters who do anything. Like, is it Viola? Wait, is it Viola? Olivia? Is it Viola who she becomes? I don't remember. We haven't read that one. It's been so long since I read 12th Night. But any of the characters, any of the women who become men, in order to act like men. Yes. They have male names, and they dress like men, and they talk like men, and they are perceived by others as men. Joan is not. Joan is from the beginning a maid of Orleans, and she is she's never, at least by the French, she's never denigrated for being a woman. At the very beginning, they're skeptical. But when they see how powerful she is, they want to build statues for her. And no longer will the patron saint of France be Saint Denis. It will be Jeanne d'Arc. Like, that's what's going to happen. And this is, like, La Pucelle becomes this, like, she is unlike any other female Shakespeare player. Character up until Act 5, which is when she's captured by the English and put on trial and sent to the stake, which is a historical fact. It's what happened to Joan of Arc. But the way that her character changes was such an about face and so jarring that I think people have to think about, there has to be another reason for that to happen. This was another writer, or this was, somebody less sympathetic to Joan, because the first 4 acts, Joan is a very self-assured and fully developed and rounded character with doubts and fears and strengths and weaknesses. And then in the end, she becomes exactly what the English have been calling her all along: a harlot, a witch. She's actually casting spells. She's, a slut who's been sleeping around. She's pregnant. That's what she appeals to the king to the warriors to not kill her because she's pregnant. Like, it's so unlike her. Yeah. From the first 4 acts. Yes, there's definitely a character shift there. But I have to say, just getting back to your point about her being a woman who nonetheless does well, and how that's very unlike the rest of Shakespeare's heroines. I have to say it's possibly because she's French, so it's not
it wouldn't have had the positive connotation that you or I could take from it now, saying like, oh yes, this is a strong female character who exhibits or shows that women can accomplish things when given the same chance as a man. It's very much, well, this is only the French would be so depraved and so desperate to call upon a woman to lead their armies. So, and obviously she's burned as a witch because that's what she is. Like,
she's crazy. God talks to her.
Exactly.
She's nuts.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think that was kind of, that's supposed to kind of overshadow everything in the first 4 acts, I feel like. I don't think the play does it very well. And I think we'll come back to the distinctions.
And that's why I think there's a complexity to her. You can read it that way, and you can read it as being, this is French depravity, but there is a complexity there that speaks to the maturity of the writer, and it reminds me of Shylock, for example, in Merchant of Venice, who is a villain but has a depth of emotion and a relatability. And that's purposeful. It's written into his character. He gets a speech that defies us to, or like it. He is a singular villain. Macbeth, Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth is one of my favorite characters of all of Shakespeare because she is complex and round, and she has feelings and emotions that I relate to. Even though I have never murdered anybody, I still feel like I understand her. Joan, I feel the same way towards, and I think that's something that I can see Shakespeare's fingerprints all over. Act 5, Joan, I don't see any of Shakespeare in. I see that as, and we'll get to that. I think that's what we're going to be bickering about. I have a feeling by the end of this episode. But I feel like the Act 5 Joan is a very different kind of female character, a very different kind of French character, and a very different kind of villain that bears no relation to the Joan that we saw in the previous 4 acts. And I just find that really interesting, and it really does bolster the argument for me that this was somebody else who maybe wrote her, or that this was the Act 5 Joan was the product of a younger Shakespeare, or somebody who was less able to deal with the nuance of character.
Yes, although I didn't notice it quite as much as you did. I noticed it after there were a few textual notes in the Folgers edition that really kind of highlighted, like, we get a totally different Joan in Act 5. I'm like, yeah, she is different. But her
you didn't even see it when we were in the BBC production?
A little bit. But here's the thing, is that in Act 5, she is captured. She has no longer access. She no longer has access to
an army.
Yeah, to any of the things that were making her masculine. She has been reduced again to a maid, a woman, a shepherd's daughter. And in that position, she does not know how to react. So in my mind, it was understandable. I agree. It's a noticeable difference, and even just some of the language she uses is a little off compared to the kind of verve she had earlier on. But the Act 5, she's in a totally different situation than she ever was before. Begging for her life. She knows she's about to burn alive. You would say and do anything you could to try and cure that. So yes, she turns into a whore by, claiming to be pregnant. But if you thought you had a chance of that working, you would do it. I mean, she's not. The bigger problem with Act 5 is that she doesn't seem that smart, whereas before she was, she didn't have a very good plan of how to get out of this in Act 5, whereas before that point she was the Master General who had, taken over every English town that Talbot had, or every French town that Talbot had previously taken. So I think those distinctions on her character are interesting, but I wasn't quite as blown away by the differences as you were.
I don't know. It just felt like it was a misstep at some point. And I'm still on the fence about which Joan is the real Joan. Would the real Joan of Arc please stand up?
Well, I don't think you're going to get her from an English author, right?
Here's the thing. Yeah, and thank you. That was a perfect segue, Aiden, because I think that Joan serves a very interesting function in literature because if you look at the depictions of Joan of Arc throughout fictional literary history, Shakespeare is the first English author listed as someone who wrote about Joan of Arc. Prior to that, it was continental European writers. after that, and as you go through the list, if you read through the various people who have written about Joan of Arc, it seems like they put her in situations that reflect their own societal changes that are going on. So, for example, during the French Revolution, you have English writers who are using Joan of Arc in order to explore the French Revolution, or you have Bertolt Brecht writing her as a labor leader, in the 1930s. You have Mark Twain, who writes like a fictional autobiography that's dictated by Joan to her page, which is just such a Twain thing to do. It's less about Joan as a character and more about what Joan represents to the author or to the author's society. And she fills a role. And I only read through and really paid attention to the English authors because I thought that was more interesting. I think the French authors revere her more because she was killed by the English. The English view her as a witch and whatever. So she's not a human.
Viewed as an other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She's not viewed as a human or as a character. She's viewed as an archetype or not even that, a stereotype or something.
Yeah, a figure. She's not a human person.
Whereas the French, I think, she's important. She has a centrality to the myth. Like
she's the patron saint of France now, right? Like,
well, yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, no, it's still Saint Denis, but anyway, Saint Joan, like Jeanne d'Arc, she is a legendary figure. So it's interesting to see how people respond to her, and I feel like what Shakespeare's doing here, or what the authors behind Henry VI Part 1 are doing, is crafting her to fit the purposes. She is an effective general because they need to have a foil or a counterweight to Talbot. So that's what the first four acts are, is her being a sophisticated general that explains Talbot's inability to hold on to France in the play itself. And in the end, she plays as a role as the vanquished witch.
Yeah.
And it's villainizing her, which is what they need to do in order to justify killing the voice of, or the person who is hearing the voice of God. Mm-hmm. Right? So I don't know. I feel like that's more interesting to me than anything else, because Joan is here the first time being written for English audiences by an English author. And we're seeing the start of this trend of fitting Joan into what they need her to be in order to represent what they need to say. Yeah. So it's a convenience. She's a convenient character to write about, which is not fair to her as a historical figure as she was, and a remarkable historical figure. I think we're going to have to do an episode about Joan of Arc. There's no question.
Lindsay?
Yes.
What did I say before this episode?
What did you say before this?
That we're going to do an episode on Joan of Arc. Yes. And you're like, no, that's stupid. Why would we do an episode on her? Oh, I don't know. Maybe because she's interesting.
No, I was the one who suggested it.
Okay.
I think we need to have this microphone running at all times.
I think it was actually running. I think we're going to check and you're going to be proven wrong.
Right. Okay.
If I longer stay, we shall begin our ancient bickerings.
So this week's discussion...
Battle of the Bicks.
Is that what we're calling it? Because we never really decided on a title.
No, we didn't, but that's what it's going to be. I just made the decision. Executive decision made right here.
Okay. Okay.
Until we change our mind, of course.
Well, you change your mind, more likely. So this week's Battle of the Bicks is about those two main characters, Joan of Arc and Talbot. And we're going to figure out right here, right now, definitively who's the more interesting character.
Yeah.
And my money's all on Talbot. And I'll tell you why, Lindsay. Yeah, well, we had to gender it. It only made sense. So I think the biggest thing he's got going for him is that he is the protagonist,
right?
First of all, and that that position gives him, it gave Shakespeare and or the other writers room to explore a fuller range of his experiences. He has a positive interaction with his one family member. Right. Joan gets her comeuppance with her father, who she denies, and
he's not my father. What are you talking about?
So you don't get that kind of human interaction that you have between, as bad as that scene is between Talbot and his son. You do get a sense that Talbot is searching for a way to care about the things that he loves, and he's open about loving them. He is fighting for England and king and country, but he has these other things that drive him as well, and he's open with them, and he's explicitly saying as much. I think that scene, while not interesting to read or see, is a peek into a character that gets more depth afforded to him than, say, Joan of Arc. And that combines with those other passages that I mentioned, like when he meets the Countess of Auvergne, Armagnac, and
Auvergne.
It's Auvergne, okay. When she's trying to kill him, and he's self-deprecating a little bit.
Yeah.
And whether or not it's the actor, I think that's silly. I'd never liked that argument. But anyways, even if it was that case, that's how the character is immortalized in the text. And I feel like it is an indication that above everything else, he cries when his associate is shot with a cannon or a sniper fire, I think it's supposed to be. And he cries over this dead man that he knew and loved. And then he's also makes fun of himself a little bit because he is small of stature but big of heart. He can be multiple things in one character. And while you don't know you're supposed to feel for him throughout the play because it is so poorly structured, you can't help but feel a little bad for him that he is. I mean, it's all kind of like there's a bit of negative plot armor, I would almost say. Like he's definitely going to die.
Right.
So all these other plots that lead to him dying feel like a little arbitrary.
Right.
Because they don't build up themselves very consistently or clearly. It's a bit of a problem for when he dies because you're like, oh, well, of course he's going to die because the Wars of the Roses is starting in the background, and that's really where the focus should be. But it still affords you a little bit of a chance to feel bad for this character who you've come to see. You've come to watch him fight valiantly many times, many times, and cry out, Talbot, and then draw his sword and fight the French.
Talbot!
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think he is actually, for a play that's not great and a bunch of characters who are not interesting or well written, he is the one that stands out for me.
I just want to say I love listening to and watching you talk about things that you have to say.
You're buttering me up to admit you're wrong.
You're very wrong.
Oh, okay.
You're very wrong.
Okay.
But I do enjoy that you have such a depth of feeling, as wrong as you are about it. It is. Well,
please do
refreshing.
share why I'm wrong, Lindsay.
Well, all the things that I previously said about Joan of Arc makes me really, it solidifies my opinion that she is the most interesting character in this play, and she's really the first interesting female character. I think Kate in Taming of the Shrew is interesting enough, but Joan is like mold breaking. Like she is such a different character, and until you get maybe Beatrice in All's Well That Ends Well, or Portia, or Lady Macbeth, Titania, you don't really get another character like Joan. And I think that's a symbol of, or a signifier of, where Shakespeare is going to be going with his treatment of women. And to have that done with a historical figure who is fictionalized to such a degree in this play, it's a bold choice. It's an interesting choice. I think you could have gotten away with depicting Joan as Act 5 Joan throughout, and have her be like play into that vicious lie that she was a witch and that she was heretical, and that this was all some nastiness on the part of the French, and have her cooking, witch's brew in a scene or whatever, like play into it, really lean into it.
Yeah. You
could have done that. Shakespeare could have done that. The choice for the first 4 acts to not do that, to have her appear on stage as smart. She's not fooled by the Dauphin's ruse at the beginning when they first meet. He hides behind his has one of his attendants pretend to be him just to test her, and she sees right through it. So she's smart, and she's a brilliant battle strategist, and she wins the respect of the entire French army, which doesn't mean much to the English. The French they don't respect the French at all. So I mean, what does it matter that they respect her? But the fact is that there are men on stage who are revering a woman. There are men on stage who are fearing a woman. They're following a woman into battle. And this was true. This actually happened. And I think depicting that in such a sympathetic light for the first 4 acts, at least, really paints Joan in a very interesting light. She's not a cold, heartless killer. She's not a soft, feminizing force either.
Yeah.
She's complicated. And I think that is unlike anything you see for, another decade almost on well, not quite that long, but several years until Shakespeare writes some of his future great female characters. I think that's really a unique thing to see. And so that makes her, in my mind, really interesting. And I'm always going to look at the female characters as a barometer of where, when we talk about Shakespeare, where the social mores are. And in this case, I think to take a French, B female, C victim of English anger, propaganda, or whatever, to take a character like that and to paint her in such a sympathetic light is, as Pierce Hawthorne would say on the television show Community, streets ahead. It's streets ahead. Streets ahead of where the other female characters are. You don't see this in Two Gentlemen of Verona. You don't see it in Taming of the Shrew, unless you apply a very liberal slant on the play. So,
well, and it'll be interesting to see how Margaret of Anjou comes out in part 2 and stuff, because we haven't read that one either. No. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I agree. Those are interesting points of why she's interesting within the canon.
Yeah. But
I don't think on the page or on the screen she's that. Although, no, I will give you, in performance, she was on the BBC version. She was much better than the Talbot was the character actor playing Talbot. I can't talk right now. He was good as well, but she was really
Brenda
excellent.
Blethyn. All props to Brenda Blethyn.
Yeah, she was
brilliant. That kind of wraps up our conversation.
Yeah.
We didn't talk at all about Christopher Marlowe and his role in perhaps writing this. But I think maybe that's going to be a separate episode in and of itself.
I think we're definitely going to be talking about Marlowe we're probably we'll probably do an episode devoted to Marlowe.
I think we're going to have to do it soon though, because Marlowe's 1593 death at Deptford is coming up. Yeah. So, I mean, unless you subscribe to the anti-Stratfordian view that Kit Marlowe faked his own death in order to continue writing as Shakespeare, his time on the stage is coming near an end.
Yeah.
So we are, but I do agree. We'll have to talk about him because he's just a colorful character to begin with.
Yes, that too.
Why have we not seen a film made about the life of Christopher Marlowe? Yeah. Noted spy, atheist, died in a bar fight. Like, this guy was a baller. He lived. He was 29 when he died. Man.
His best life.
Man, we should do that as our podcast.
But get stabbed in a bar fight?
No, talk about Christopher Marlowe.
Oh, yeah, well,
just completely change. Just the whole podcast. Let's just have episode after episode about Christopher Marlowe, Tamburlaine, the Jew of Malta, and let's just do it. Screw the Bix pod. the Kit pod.
The Kit pod.
No, I don't know. This is lame.
But this has been our discussion of Henry VI Part 1. Thank you for joining us. And we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode. We haven't decided what our next special episode is. It might be Christopher Marlowe.
It might be. It might
be Joan of Arc.
Maybe both. Maybe we'll do both.
No, we're not going to do both at once. That's a terrible idea.
Let's do both.
Elaborate heist.
You can find all our episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast fix.
If you want to tell us what you think of Shakespeare, his plays, poems, or any of the topics we discuss, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us on Twitter, that's @TheBixPod.
On Facebook at facebook.com/TheBixPod, or by email at thebigspod@gmail.com. That's our cue to exit.